So today we are very pleased to welcome our fourth Maine Law Justice for Women Lecture Series speaker. That's a mouthful. Before I introduce our guest, I would very much like to thank Kathy Lee, who is the visionary powerhouse behind this series, and we are very pleased to be part of it. And Danielle Conway, who's sitting in front here, Maine Law School's Dean, and she has very generously said that the law school is open for business to any Deering High School student who is interested in attending their programming. So you should go. And we thank her for continuing to bring Portland an international perspective on women's rights. Thank you for that. So this year's guest, Ms. Zainah Anwar, is a lawyer and a former member of the Human Rights Commission in Malaysia, where 20 years ago, before it was cool, she founded Sisters in Islam, a social justice organization that promotes a progressive, rights-based understanding of Islam based on the Quran. Named one of the 10 most influential Muslims in 2013, Ms. Anwar currently directs Musawah, a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. So if you would please join me in welcoming Zainah Anwar to the stage. The way this will work is I hope Ms. Anwar will give a couple of opening comments, say a few things about who she is, and then Dilanta and Alex will ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So be thinking of something pithy to ask.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation to be here with all of you. I'm really impressed that the school has a global studies program and it's producing students with a global outlook, because I think in this world today that is extremely important. And I'm really happy to be here to share with you the work that I do on women's rights in Islam, in particular in the context of America, where the kind of Islam that you are most exposed to is, you know, violence, terrorism, war, destruction, injustice against women. So I want to offer, you know, a vision of Islam, and that's taking place in the Muslim world, in the Muslim context today, where women in particular are at the forefront of a movement towards change, a movement towards equality and justice for Muslim women living in Muslim context. And my group, two groups that I co-founded, briefly, one is called Sisters in Islam and the other one is called Musawah, which means equality in Arabic, and that's a global movement. But I'm one of the co-founders of Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Malaysia. I hope more people are familiar with Malaysia than when I first came to the United States in 1976, when nobody had heard of Malaysia, and people were asking me whether we live on trees, and I told them, yeah, we swing from tree to tree to avoid the traffic jams. I form, 8 of us who form Sisters in Islam, really, you know, because of the complaints that women were coming to us. You know, we were all professional women, and there were just so many complaints that were coming to us from women in terms of their experience with the Sharia courts, with the Islamic courts, and with the religious department. Because in Malaysia, we're 60% Muslim. And Muslims are governed in the family, the personal status law, the family law is an Islamic family law. And unfortunately, you know, there's a lot of discrimination in the substance of the law, and in particular in the practice of the law. And so women were complaining, you know, the husband has taken a second wife, they go to the religious department to complain, and then they're told that, oh, in Islam a man has a right to 4 wives. The husband beat them, and they go to the religious department to complain, and they say, oh, in Islam, a man has a right to beat his wife. A man has a right to demand obedience from his wife. A man is superior to a woman, so therefore he is the leader and you should obey him. So all these discriminatory pronouncements made in the name of Islam, they really outrage us, because we grew up with the idea that God is just, that Islam is just. So how come as adults we're like confronted with so much injustice against women that's justified in the name of Islam? So we felt the urgent need and necessity to really go back to the Quran, which is the revealed text of the religion, to find out whether the Quran really justifies discrimination against women, whether the Quran really said that a man has a right to 4 wives. And when we decided to open up the Quran once again, with feminist eyes, asking feminist rights-based question to the text, we were really, stunned and pleasantly surprised, and a very liberating and uplifting experience for us to actually find so many verses in the Quran that talk about justice, about equality between men and women, that men and women are each other's partner and friend, and men and women are as close to each other as a garment on your body. It talks about men and women, a relationship of love and compassion between men and women. So the question that naturally arose to us is, how come these incredible values, in the Quran, how come that is not reflected in the family laws and in the practice that govern the relationship between men and women? So that was really how the questioning began, and we felt then the urgent necessity for us to create a public voice, to offer an alternative vision of Islam, to challenge that dominant misogynistic narrative, patriarchal narrative that promotes an Islam where it's not possible for men and women to be equal. So that's really how we began, and the issue, there was just 8 of us. We met every week in my house to study the Quran, and we decided that we really needed to bring out this alternative ideas and values that exist in the Quran that promote equality and justice, to bring that out into the public space. So then how do you do that when you are 8 women we're not regarded as having the authority to speak on Islam, because in the tradition only those in religious authority have the right to speak on Islam, and we ordinary citizens do not have the authority to speak on Islam. But we live in a democratic state. There's a media, so we decided to use the media to write letters to the editor to start challenging the dominant narrative on issues such as polygamy, equality, domestic violence, dress and hijab and all that. And so that's really how we began to create a public voice, an alternative public voice that speaks of equality and justice and challenge the ways the religious authorities use the religion to justify discrimination against women. And that's really how we began in Malaysia, and the impact had been global. That was not planned, but there was so much interest in the work that we do, because all over the world Muslim women were being discriminated against in the name of Islam. So there was a lot of interest in the work that we do in terms of understanding Islam and pushing for reform of Islamic laws. And that eventually led us to launch a global movement called Musawah, bringing together women's rights groups and scholars working on issues of equality and justice in Muslim context together to form this global movement and a public international voice of women demanding change and demanding reform. So I will end there, and then we can start the question.
So, Ms. Anwar, Sister of Islam exists to bring justice to women as accorded to them by the Quran. How has your community taken to you for looking at the Quran and Islam through a feminist lens in order to advocate for women's rights? And how has that furthered your movement, and how has that also created some barriers for you?
Yeah, very important question. This work is not easy work. We do a lot of training on women's rights in Islam, and we tell the activists that we train, if you want to engage with the religion, you have to be prepared for the attacks that will come. Because you will be attacked, because you as women are not seen as having the authority to speak on matters of religion. You're supposed to just listen to the religious authorities and obey and not question. And so so the work that we do is of course controversial. There have been several, we've had court cases, we've had our book banned. We did a book called The Impact of Islamic Extremism on Women's Rights, and the book was banned by the religious authorities because they said it's a threat to public order. So talking about equality is a threat to public order. And we've got a fatwa against us right now. A fatwa is a religious ruling. They have accused us of being deviants because we believe in pluralism and liberalism. So it's a huge challenge. You get attacked, police reports lodged against you for the position that you take that contradicts the traditional misogynistic position. So lots and lots of challenges, but for us, we look at each challenge as an opportunity to open up the public space for debate, because the public space for debate on matters of religion is really something new in the Muslim world. Where, like I said, we've been brought up to believe that only the religious authorities have a right to speak on Islam. So for us, each attack is an opportunity to generate public debate and public discussion. So when they banned our book, we took them to court. And we won. We won at the High Court level, we won at the Court of Appeal level, we won at the Federal Court level. And actually, when we decided to take them to court, it was not, for us it was not important whether we win or we lose, but to generate a public debate and to also send notice to the religious authorities that they do not have a monopoly on matters of religion, and to also show the public that we are not scared of them, that this is important, that when Islam is used as a source of law and public policy within a democratic nation state, that all citizens have a right to define what Islam means to us and how it's going to use to run our lives.
So what do you see and what have you found to be the most effective way to cause social change on a large scale? Would you say it's like speaking publicly, education, legal action, or some combination?
Yeah, it's really not just one strategy, but in the Muslim context, in terms of talking about Islam, I think public education is extremely important. Because again, like I said, we've all been brought up to believe that there is only one interpretation of Islam. And that dominant interpretation that dominates our lives and the public space is a very misogynistic understanding of Islam. And so, creating that public space where we have the right to offer an alternative vision of Islam is extremely important, because we need to build public support for the kind of Islam that we believe in. So the public education work is extremely important, because basically, as I've always said, you can't do this work without knowledge. Knowledge is power, and knowledge gives you courage. Because you're going to be attacked. So it is that knowledge that's going to give you courage to stand your ground when you are attacked. You have to be convinced inside yourself that what you're saying and what you believe and what you're doing is right, because you're going to be attacked by people in authority. And so that public education and building support is extremely important, because when you're attacked, you want others to speak up for you, to defend you, to support your work. So building that public support is extremely important. So the public education work that we do is extremely important. The legal reform work that we do is extremely important. We have a legal clinic, a gender-sensitive legal clinic, where women, many of them single mothers, come to us for legal advice, and we give them support and legal advice. And they become our supporters. So ordinary women, not not well-educated women like us, and we are labeled as Western feminists, Westernized feminists, trying to impose Western values on the Muslim community. But these are ordinary Muslims, who don't declare themselves as feminists, but actually have very feminist beliefs, because they are basically very tired of the bad behavior of the men in their lives, and they are speaking out. So getting them, ordinary women, to speak up on the issue of equality of justice is extremely important. So there are many different strategies, but I think in the Muslim context is that public education, public space, public voice, public culture of debate on matters of religion, for me, is the most important and strategic way to go.
Thank you. Since you stepped down as the Executive Director of SIS, Sisters in Islam, you are now the Director of Musawah, a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. Can you briefly describe what this organization is about and what it does in terms of the international view on Islam?
Yeah, so Musawah was launched in 2009, so we've been in existence now for about 7-8 years. And it's really grown, exponentially in terms of the work that we do and the impact that we've had. We work in 3 areas. Knowledge building is the key area. We see ourselves as a knowledge building movement. Like I said, knowledge is everything. Knowledge is so important. So we've been doing the past few years, 4 or 5 years, we've been doing research on the whole issue of male authority over women in the Muslim legal tradition. Because this concept of male authority, the man as the provider and the protector of the women and children in the family, underpins the discriminatory legal framework in Islam that governs our lives to this very day, the 21st century. And so we're challenging this concept of male authority and rethinking the concept of male authority and pushing for marriage as a partnership of equals, that there cannot be just one single person, and it has to be the male. It depends on who is best qualified to do the job. Many Muslim men are actually, feel tremendous pressure that they are supposed to provide and to protect when they can't provide and protect, and that they know that the women in their lives, their wives, their partners, are equally providing and protecting. But the law has not changed to reflect that changing realities on the ground. So we've come out with all kinds of books, lived realities, global documentation of the disconnect between law and reality in 9 countries. We interviewed women who are impacted by this myth of the male protector and provider, because in real life they don't have a male protector or provider. They are the protector, they are the providers of their families, because the men in their families are gone, missing in action. So what we want to do, what we hope to do, is to really change the legal framework that governs family life in the Muslim context, to push towards a legal framework that recognizes equality and that recognizes marriage as a partnership of equals. And then the other area of work is the training that we do. We call that capacity building, where again, all this knowledge, what do you do with this knowledge? How do you bring about change and reform in the Muslim context? Knowledge has to be translated into action. And the way we do it is we do what we call it's a very intensive 7-day training on Islam and gender equality and justice, where women's rights activists, human rights activists, so we do have men as well in the training, policymakers attend the 7-day training to understand Islam from a rights perspective. And we expose them to the production of knowledge in the Islamic tradition, how the Quran is understood, how the Quran is interpreted, how fiqh, jurisprudence, how the jurists develop juristic principles to define Islamic law, and the hadith, the traditions of the Prophet. So basically, to understand that the production of knowledge in the Islamic tradition is a human constructed knowledge. This is not divine knowledge. This is not the divine word of God. Because so often when we are pushing for change, when we're arguing for justice, for equality, we're told that we're challenging God's words, that this is divine law, infallible God's law that cannot be changed. What in our trainings, we expose the participants to the understanding that this is not God's law, it's human constructed law. The values might come from a revealed text, from the Quran, from the divine word of God, but the interaction between human beings and the word of God produce understandings, knowledge, laws, practices that's human constructed. Because it is human constructed, it's fallible, it's not infallible, and it can change given changing times and context. So it's constructed, therefore it can be deconstructed, and it can be reconstructed to meet changing times and circumstances. And the third area of work that we do is international advocacy. And here we engage with the United Nations. I think I heard that some of you are in the Model UN program and all that. So we engage with the most important convention for women's rights activists, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Convention. And some of you might not have heard of it because the United States is one of the 4 countries in the world, joining 3 other Muslim countries, that have not ratified CEDAW. And so CEDAW is a very important convention for women's rights groups, especially in Muslim countries, because there the United Nations holds the governments accountable to progress on women's rights at the national level. And so we intervene in that process. Governments have to report to the UN, to the CEDAW committee, on how much progress have they made on the various articles under CEDAW. And we produce what we call a thematic report on marriage and family, Article 16 on marriage and family, where the CEDAW Convention demands that equal age of marriage, minimum age of marriage, equal right to divorce, equal right to guardianship of children, and all, equality in all these areas of marriage and family. And we basically challenge the ways governments use Islam to justify why they cannot comply with their treaty obligations. And so we engage very closely with the CEDAW committee members and with the NGOs who submit shadow reports. So the government will submit a report to the UN saying all these wonderful things that we've done over the past years to advance women's rights. And the NGOs will produce what is called a shadow report to basically challenge the government. No, what the government says is not true. The reality on the ground is this, that, and the other. And so we support the NGOs and their engagement. We support the CEDAW committee to really bring forward a more constructive engagement with the governments. Because again, the governments will tell the CEDAW committee and tell the UN, this is divine law. This is the word of God. We cannot change. So therefore, we cannot comply with our treaty obligations. And we tell the CEDAW committee, no, this is not divine law. This is human constructed law. And we produce what we call a good practices table, where there are good practices in many Muslim countries. For example, like I said, Tunisia has banned polygamy on the basis of an understanding of Islam. Many Muslim countries have minimum age of marriage at 18. So if it is divine law, why are there differences in the laws of the different countries? So, we provide all these arguments for the CEDAW committee to engage more constructively with Muslim governments when they just say that, oh, this is God's law, it cannot be changed. Obviously, the position that we take is that it can be changed. Yeah? So those are the 3 areas of work that we do in Musawah. And we work in over 40 countries with activists and scholars in over 40 countries to be a part of the movement.
Thank you. So, given that you can and have faced sort of opposition from a legal standpoint, in general, do you think that people have any sort of responsibility to not follow a law if they find it to be unjust? Or should they sort of work within the system and challenge the law?
Well, of course, if it's an unjust law, I think we should challenge it. And there are many ways in which you can challenge unjust law. You can take them to court. So, for example, the religious authorities have the right to issue a fatwa, a ruling against us, against sisters in Islam, to say that we are deviant. They have a right to do it, but we are challenging it on constitutional grounds. And because it affects our freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion, to have a different understanding of Islam. And going to court, and it's really wonderful in the Malaysian context where we have lawyers who do this work for free for us. We had a corporation who raised funds to support our legal cases, our court cases. And so, again, that idea of taking it to court, challenging it, to create, again, to expand that public space for debate on these matters, to get our arguments on why these laws are unconstitutional, and that if you want to use religion as a source of law and public policy within a constitutional democratic system, that the understandings of the religion must also comply with constitutional, fundamental liberties guaranteed under the Constitution. That this is extremely important. It's because we don't live in a religious state. We don't live in a theocratic state. We live within a democracy. So when you use religion as a source of law, those religious understandings have to comply with the constitutional guarantees of equality, non-discrimination, and fundamental liberties. So challenging that and advancing the debate and opening up the space for debate on the role of religion within a democratic constitutional context is extremely important.
I think now we're going to open up to the public if anybody has a question.
Why do some people, they say I saw a poster once of, they said that some girls marry at 15 in other countries, and that's impossible.
So the question is, why some?
Is it why is it permitted?
Yeah.
Yes, why is it permitted?
Well, according to the laws of the US, I'm sure it's not permitted, right? It's against the law to marry at 15. Is there a minimum age of marriage in the US?
It depends on the state.
On the state. Okay, so that's interesting. So you have to look at your state laws. Whether there is a minimum age of marriage. We are pushing for a minimum age of marriage to be 18 because the Children's Act, the Children's Convention, the United Nations Children's Convention defines a child as anyone below 18. So we want the minimum age of marriage to be set at 18. And many Muslim countries already have the minimum age of marriage at 18. But of course, what the law says and what happens in practice, very often contradict each other. So you may have a minimum age of marriage at 18, but culture has not changed. Attitudes and values of the community have not changed to recognize 18 as the minimum age of marriage. So law reform is one strategy, and I think it's important to have law reform to set a standard to which we aspire to and to provide protection. But the work also has to happen at the community level, where you change values and attitudes and you use the lived realities, the harm that it causes to a child of 15 to marry at that age, which means she is deprived of her right to education, she is deprived of her right to work, so there are many rights that the girl should have that are violated when she is married off at a young age. So it's important that we work at the community level to really build public awareness of the damage to a girl's health and to a girl's rights to be married off at an early age. And I would hope that all the states in the United States really should set a minimum age of marriage and make it an offense to, for a girl to marry below that age, and to prosecute the offenders. In some countries, they even prosecute the person who marries the girl at their young age. So it's not just the man who marries the girl, but the religious authority, the imam who married that young girl, can also be prosecuted for violating the law and allowing it to happen.
Other questions?
I was wondering if you could just give a few examples of what you found originally in your earlier work when you first started to look at the Quran with your group of 8 women, because I think, I am not super well informed on Islam in general, and I do think sometimes the presentation in the US of what we might see just in regular media is presenting one interpretation. So I'm just wondering if you could give a real quick summary for some of us who are less well informed about what is in the Quran, what you found that was sort of buoying and encouraging and made you feel sort of actually liberated that there was this other interpretation possible.
Yeah, I guess the first issue that we dealt with was the issue of polygamy, because polygamy is such a huge issue in many Muslim countries. Men's supposed right to have more than one wife causes so much harm to the family well-being, to to the existing wife, to the children of the first wife, and even to second wives, and even to the men themselves who find out that they actually cannot cope with the demands of multiple wives and children that they have no time to spend with, that they don't have money to provide for. So it causes so much harm. And so that was the first issue we dealt with, where we looked at the Quran, we opened up the Quran and looked at the verse on polygamy. And for the 8 of us, all 8 of us actually, 7 of us out of 8, because the other person was a Quranic scholar, so she knew. It was the first time that we read the verse in the Quran on polygamy. It was the first time that because we've grown up with a belief that this is a man's right in Islam, he can marry 2, 3, or 4. And when we read the verse on polygamy, we discovered that the verse goes on to say, marry 2, 3, or 4, but if you fear you cannot do justice, marry only one. And that will be best for you to prevent you from doing injustice. So when we read the verse, it's like, eureka, like this is amazing. This is the verse of the Quran that speaks to us, our concerns about being treated unfairly and unjustly. And so the natural question that arose for us is, how come one part of the verse that says marry 2, 3, or 4 is universally known? Every Muslim and everyone in the world seems to know that in Islam a man has a right to 4 wives. But the other half of the verse that says marry only one and that will be best for you, why is that not known publicly? Why is that part of the verse silent and silenced? And so when women's rights activists discover this verse, then of course we want to bring it up to the public space to educate Muslims that look, polygamy is not an unconditional right in Islam. That the verse in the Quran actually says marry only one and that will be best for you, and why can't this part of the verse be the source of law and public policy? So that's really how we began, and then we did further research and develop a methodology. How do you interpret verses in the Quran? You have to interpret it holistically. So the classical jurists of Islam would just see 2, 3, 4 and forget the rest of the verse, because in reading marry 2, 3, or 4, it validates their experience, their life experience, their desire for multiple sexual partners. God has spoken to me, I have a right to multiple sexual partners. But women are not happy with that particular reading of the verse. So, and also the context in which the verse was revealed. So we did research on that. The context that the verse on polygamy was revealed was a context of the early years of Islam, where there were many wars and there were many widows and orphans. So it was actually to protect widows and orphans who were left without the male protector and the male provider. And the property of the orphans were exploited by men. So they were supposed to protect widows and orphans. So that was the context of revelation. And then we look at the trajectory of the message. So the trajectory of the message says actually marry only one if you cannot do justice. And there is another verse, so reading the Quran holistically, what are the other verses in the Quran that talk about the same issue? So there's another verse in the Quran that says, no matter how hard you try, you can never treat women equally. So based on these understandings of Islam, Tunisia banned polygamy. Yeah, so the possibility for change, for reform is there. And there's the tradition of the Prophet. When the Prophet's son-in-law wanted to take another wife, he forbade the son-in-law from taking another wife, because he said, what hurts my daughter Fatima hurts me as well. So we used all this to then point out that polygamy is not a man's right in Islam. That is actually, there's severe restrictions, and if you were to follow the message of the Quran to do justice, actually polygamy in most circumstances would be impossible. A just polygamous marriage would be impossible to achieve. So that's how we understand it, and then we write letters to the editor on it. We generate a public discussion so that people know. Now if you ask in the streets of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, almost everyone you ask will know that the verse on polygamy actually says marry only one. In the past, people did not know that, but because of the public education work we've done, generating the debate in the media, in the public space, almost everybody would know what the verse on polygamy actually says. So this is the kind of change that we want to bring, a change in the knowledge, a change in the understanding, and a change in the methodology of how you understand the Quran, and then use it as a source of law and public policy.
Not that you need one, but have you had a traditionalist superstar or authority of religion that's voiced their opinion toward your views that has been like not validating, but like kind of changed momentum?
Yeah, I mean, over the past 15 years, the growth in the scholarship on Islamic studies, especially that promotes equality and justice, fundamental liberties, has been tremendous. And many of the scholars are actually in the United States. These are all Muslim scholars who have left their countries to live in the US, to work in American universities, to teach Islam, to teach Islamic law. So there's incredible work. Khalid Abu Fadil is one scholar teaching at the law school in UCLA. His work is extremely important to us, to women's rights activists. Many scholars, Abdullahi An-Naim, Amina Wadud, who was at the Virginia State University. So there are actually many scholars now, an incredible scholarship that has emerged. And in Indonesia, in countries like Indonesia, in Tunisia, in Morocco, there are very important scholars and even traditional religious authorities that are far more progressive than the dominant traditional position that's taken in many Muslim countries. So this is where we use the good practices of other countries to justify why reform is possible, and to justify, look, this is not divine law, this is human understanding of the divine word of God, and therefore it can be changed. And you look at the evidence in Morocco, the family law there recognizes equality between men and women. Yeah, it's within the framework of marriage as a partnership of equals. If it's possible in Morocco on the basis of an understanding of Islam, it is possible for other Muslim countries. So the issue then is not so much Islam, the issue is the political will, the lack of political will of the men in authority, the patriarchs in authority, and really resisting the demand for change. So this is why the public education, the public pressure that we do is extremely important to push for the kind of change that we want. So yes, there's incredible, exciting scholarship, and we ourselves, Musawah, the scholarship that we produced, this book that's available on Amazon, Men in Charge, ? Rethinking Authority in Muslim Legal Tradition. It is now used in over 20 universities, in many law schools, Islamic Studies program, Gender Studies program, at Harvard, University of Chicago, in various universities in the US and Canada, in the Muslim world, are already using that book and the scholarship that we are producing, challenging the traditionalist scholarship that discriminates against women. So there's a lot of exciting work that's taking place now in terms of the scholarship. That's a young person.
So, I assume men are typically more likely to dislike what you're saying and try to discredit you, but how does the conversation change when you're talking to another woman who believes that she doesn't need more rights, and
she doesn't need more rights,
that she doesn't need her rights advocated for, believes that the abuse and oppression she faces is not only the norm but correct for her religion?
I guess there are two ways I can answer that question. There are women who are, of course, against the work that we do. because they buy into that patriarchal traditional scholarship and that what we're doing is against the teachings of Islam. So there are those kinds of women who support polygamy. But you scratch under the surface, a different language comes out. Many of the women that we train, in particular the single mothers that we train, there is a public belief that they're traditional women who believe in male authority over women, and that's the public facade that they give. But when we train them, when we create a safe space behind closed doors to talk about the realities of their lives, these women actually are the most rabid feminists. These women talk about the bad behavior of the men in their lives, about the suffering and the injustice on a daily basis. Where is the male provider? Where is the male protector? And on that basis, men are privileged in the Islamic legal tradition. They don't exist in many of these women's lives. These are female heads of household, female heads of families, and they're tired of the bad behavior of the men in their lives who are not there, supposedly to protect and to provide for them. And when we do our gender training with them, when we do our time use survey with them, like what do they do from the moment they wake up to the moment they sleep, what do their husbands do from the moment they wake up to the moment they sleep, there's a huge, the women's list of duties and responsibilities go into 2 pages, and the husband is like maybe this short, And so this kind of training really, gives the women the courage to actually speak what is in their heart. That actually the men are missing in action. This is their language, not ours. They're lost in space. They're gone with the wind. They are the ones who buy our message most readily because they suffer the injustice on a daily basis. So we get a lot of support from women who suffer the discrimination. So we've had women, I've had a woman, a labor leader actually, a union leader, who came to me and apologized for publicly opposing our work and labeling our work as against Islam. And then when the husband ill-treated her, she wanted a divorce, the husband refused to give her a divorce, and she saw the discrimination. Before that, your life is privileged, everything is wonderful, you have nothing to complain about. But when you have problems and you start engaging with the system and you see the discrimination in the system, that's when you realize that, it's stacked against you, that discrimination does exist, and the fact that it is justified in the name of religion makes it even more difficult for you to challenge it. And then who did she come to for help? She came to us. To provide her legal advice, to provide her legal support, and then she apologized and said, I'm so sorry I took a position against your work, I was wrong. So you have that kind of women, but of course you also find women who are in political parties, believing in the Islamic State and supremacy of Islamic law, who will be ideologically against the work that we do.
Thank you very much. So we now want to invite Ms. Schmidt to the stage.
And I'd like to introduce the mayor.
And Mayor Strimling also.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You guys did a wonderful job. Thank you for our questions from the audience. And now, as is our tradition, the mayor of Portland, Ethan Strimling, would like to say a few kind words to our guest.
Thank you very much. I'm sure the presentation, I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here for all of it, but I'm sure the presentation was great. We in this city have made equality one of the cornerstones of our fight. Every day trying to figure out how we make our city more equal, more representative, more just, and I know that's the work that you have dedicated your life to, and because of that work and your being here, I wanted to offer you a key to the city that hopefully you will cherish, and when you come back, I promise we won't have changed the lock, so you can still use this key.
And then finally, we have the highly coveted, internationally renowned gift for you, a plaque of Deering High School we'd love to present to you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.